What if the greatest danger inside Yellowstone has nothing to do with the supervolcano everyone talks about, and everything to do with the thin crust of ground people walk on every single summer? Because on one dark morning in June, that crust ripped open. And the part that should genuinely unsettle you is what came next. It did not end in seconds. It kept failing for a week. Before we go any further, I need 10 seconds of your time. If you want the real story instead of the panic version, hit like right now, because that one tap decides whether YouTube shows this to another curious person or buries it. Subscribe so you catch the follow-up when the data finally goes public, and share this with anyone who thinks Yellowstone is about to end the world. By the end of this video, they'll understand the actual threat. It's smaller than they fear and much closer than they think. Now let me take you to that morning. It was still dark, just after 5 in the morning, Mountain Time, on Saturday the 13th of June. Most of Yellowstone was asleep. No tourists on the boardwalks, no cars on the road, no voices anywhere, only steam drifting quietly off the thermal pools, the way it has for thousands of years. But inside Biscuit Basin, a small cluster of scientific instruments was awake, doing what it does every second of every day, recording the pulse of the ground. And at 9 minutes past 5, those instruments caught something that did not belong there. It was not the slow background hum of a thermal basin behaving normally. It was a sharp spike of seismic energy, a hard jolt inside the rock. And traveling alongside it came something called infrasound. That is a pressure wave moving through the air at a frequency too low for human ears to detect. You could have been standing right there and heard almost nothing unusual. The instruments heard everything. And when those two signals arrive together, seismic and infrasound at the same instant, it means one simple thing. Something underground has just broken, fast and with force. The signal pointed toward a location roughly 2 miles northwest of Old Faithful. A hot spring with a name that anyone who follows Yellowstone already recognizes. Black Diamond Pool. And the second that name came up, almost everyone assumed they already knew exactly what had happened, because Black Diamond Pool has a reputation. On the 23rd of July, 2024, just before 10 in the morning, the pool exploded. Water, mud, and rock shot 400 to 600 feet straight up into the sky. Tourists were standing on the boardwalk when it happened. They turned and ran. The boardwalk behind them was shredded. Debris landed across roughly a square kilometer of ground. The entire event lasted about 55 seconds. And somehow, by pure luck, nobody died. Biscuit Basin has been closed to the public ever since that day. So when those instruments lit up before dawn in June, the conclusion looked obvious. Black Diamond Pool had gone off again. Same pool, same story. New date, everyone move along. Except the data quietly refused to agree, and that refusal is where this whole story turns. There was a temperature sensor sitting directly inside the pool. Not near it, inside it. If that pool had truly torn itself apart again, that sensor should have gone wild. A violent spike, a sudden crash, something impossible to miss. Instead, it moved a little. A small change, barely a shrug. And that left scientists in a very strange position. Something had absolutely exploded. The seismic reading and the sound pulse left zero room for doubt, but it had not come from the famous pool that everyone had been watching for 2 years. The answer came from a camera that had only been installed at that site the year before, in May of 2025. At 9 minutes and 50 seconds past 5, that camera recorded a dark plume of steam blasting upward, not from Black Diamond Pool, from bare ground just to the north of it. Plain dirt. No famous feature, no name, no history. Nothing that had ever done anything remarkable in living memory. And that ordinary patch of nothing had just torn itself wide open. Hold on to that detail because it runs like a thread through this entire story. For nearly 2 years, every eye, every camera, every sensor, and every headline had been pointed at one specific pool. And when the ground finally broke, it broke right next door. In the one place nobody was really watching, when geologists finally reached the site in daylight, they were not looking at one new hole. They found three. 3 separate groups of freshly punched vents, all sitting north of Black Diamond Pool, openings that simply did not exist the previous day. Hot water had surged out of them in large volumes and run downhill straight into the Firehole River. By the time the team arrived, most of those vents had already fallen quiet, but the northernmost one was still going, still pushing water out, still feeding the river, and that northern vent had a feature that tells you a lot about the force involved. It sat on a crack, a fracture running roughly north-northwest through the earth, about 18.5 meters long. That is around 61 feet. In some places, that crack gaped open a full 1.5 meters wide, roughly 5 feet across. Sit with that image for a moment. A split in the ground longer than a school bus, wide enough in places to swallow a grown adult, opened in a single morning, in soil that had been perfectly solid the night before. The water pouring out measured around 90 degrees Celsius, nearly 200 degrees Fahrenheit. At Yellowstone's high elevation, that is essentially boiling. This was not warm water seeping gently through the soil. This was near boiling water being forced up out of the earth under serious pressure, carving new exits for itself as it went. Now, let me be honest with you about the size of this, because I am not here to sell you fear. The rocks thrown out by this explosion only landed a few meters from the vents. That single detail tells geologists the blast itself was small. Nothing remotely like 2024, when debris rained down across an entire square kilometer. If you judge June the 13th purely by how loud the bang was, it was a minor event. A small hydrothermal explosion. The kind of thing that happens somewhere in Yellowstone roughly once a year without making the news at all. And yet, you could see the aftermath from miles away. Not because of the explosion, because of the river. Downstream of Biscuit Basin, the Firehole River changed color. It turned a pale, milky gray. That is the exact shade of water carrying an enormous load of fine sediment. And that gray stain traveled roughly 6 kilometers downstream. Almost 4 miles, drifting steadily toward Midway Geyser Basin, while most visitors had no idea what they were actually looking at. Think about what that gray water really is. It is a receipt. Physical, visible proof that the shallow plumbing system beneath Biscuit Basin had just flushed a huge volume of sediment-filled water out of itself in a very short window of time. The ground did not simply crack open. It emptied part of its insides into a river, in public, in daylight, and then went quiet again. But here's the thing nobody expected. The ground was not finished. Quick pause, and I promise this is worth it. If this story has already changed how you picture Yellowstone, tap that like button. It genuinely pushes this video to more people who want facts instead of fear. And drop the word collapse in the comments, because that is exactly what happens next. And I want to see who is still with me this far in. If you are new here, subscribe now, because the second half of this story contains the one detail that makes this event scientifically priceless. So, the days after the explosion. In the days following, June the 13th, the scientists monitoring this site saw something appear that had not been there when they first walked the ground. A brand new pool of water, sitting near the middle group of vents, boiling hard, gray, thick with sediment. It had not been there before, and then it simply was. But how it formed is the part that genuinely matters. When a new feature suddenly appears at Yellowstone, it is almost always an explosion crater. A hole punched outward by a blast, surrounded by a ring of thrown rock and debris. You can see the mess it made. The evidence is scattered all around it. This new pool had no mess around it at all. No apron of blasted material. Nothing. According to the United States Geological Survey, this pool did not form by exploding. It formed by collapsing. The ground caved inward. It sank down into the hot, pressurized zone beneath it, and the hollow it left behind filled with boiling water. Look at the timing, because the timing changes everything. The explosion happened on the 13th. This pool appeared later, somewhere between the afternoon of the 14th and the morning of the 16th. So the blast was not the event. The blast was only the beginning of the event. For days afterward, the ground kept quietly rearranging itself while the surface looked calm and nobody could see what was happening underneath. Here are the actual numbers, because numbers make it real. The new pool measured about 6.5 meters by 5 1/3 meters, roughly 21 feet by 17 feet. Boiling water sitting exactly where solid, walkable ground had been standing only days earlier. And it did not stay calm either. By June the 18th, that brand new pool started erupting on its own. Several bursts, each lasting minutes, throwing boiling water 6 to 9 meters into the air. That is 20 to 30 feet, roughly the height of a 3-story building over and over, from a feature that had not existed the week before. Now let me explain why a collapse is more unsettling than an explosion, because most people get this backwards. An explosion is loud and terrifying, but it is honest. It happens. It is over, and you can see the damage it left behind. A collapse is quieter, slower, and far more revealing. A collapse means the ground underneath had been hollowed out or weakened so badly that it could no longer hold its own weight. So it dropped, days after the blast, down into the heat. And in the meantime, the surface looked completely ordinary. A person could have walked straight across it and felt nothing wrong. Then, on its own schedule, with no warning at all, it gave way into boiling water. Put the entire sequence together, because this is the real anomaly here. Day 1, an explosion, a long fracture, and 3 sets of new vents. 2 to 3 days later, the ground sinks inward and a boiling pool is born. 5 days after that, the new pool begins spouting all by itself. The danger did not end when the noise stopped. The system kept failing, kept shifting, kept opening new mouths in the earth for most of a full week. Scientists were standing on ground that later caved into near boiling water. That is not a single accident. That is a process. And now we reach the number that turns this from a strange local event into something historic. 100 meters, about 328 feet. That is the distance between the spot where the ground opened on June the 13th and a monitoring station the Yellowstone Volcano Observatory had installed the previous summer. According to the USGS, no hydrothermal explosion in recorded history has ever happened this close to dedicated scientific instruments. Not one. Ever. This is the closest range anyone has ever had on an event like this, while it was actually happening in real time. To understand why that matters so much, compare it with 2024. The bigger blast, the one that destroyed the boardwalk and nearly killed people. Back then, there was no hydrothermal monitoring station anywhere near the site. The observatory's wider network barely registered it. One of the most dramatic hydrothermal explosions in the park's modern history took place, and the instruments almost completely missed it. Scientists were left doing detective work afterward, measuring scattered rocks, reconstructing the event backwards from wreckage, with almost no real-time record of the moment itself. Distance destroys data. That is the simplest way to say it. A seismometer sitting miles away records a faint smear, a blurry wiggle on a line. A seismometer 100 meters away records the sharp, detailed fingerprint of rock cracking apart, second by second. An infrasound sensor beside the vent captures the true sound of steam ripping through the surface, not a muffled echo arriving late and softened by distance. A temperature probe in the water tells you how the heat behaved before, during, and after. And a camera on site does not just prove something happened, it timestamps the plume down to the half second and shows you the exact patch of Earth that failed. Now stack all of that together. 4 different types of instruments, all running at the same moment, all within the length of a football field from the blast. A seismometer basically next door, an infrasound sensor listening, a temperature probe sitting inside the pool, a camera pointed at the ground. When the Earth opened, every single one of them was recording, which means, for the first time in history, scientists may be holding a high-resolution, close-range record of how one of these explosions actually begins. The seismic behavior in the final seconds, the pressure pulse, the heat signature, the whole visual sequence, frame by frame, from the neighborhood of the blast itself. An event that has always been nearly impossible to study up close chose, by pure chance, to happen in the single best instrumented spot it possibly could have. And what those machines captured in the moments before the ground broke is now the biggest open question in this entire field of science. Let me pause here for a second and say something honest. This kind of video takes days to research and write, and it lives or dies on whether people engage with it. So if you have found this genuinely interesting, do me one favor, like it. Then hit subscribe, because when the observatory publishes what those instruments recorded, I will break it down for you in plain English before the headlines twist it. And if there is one person in your life who forwards you doomsday clips about Yellowstone, send them this instead. Curiosity travels further than panic. Let's give it a push. Now, to understand why that question about warning signals matters so much, you need to know what is actually happening beneath these basins. And the mechanism is simple enough to picture clearly in your head. Underneath Yellowstone's thermal areas, hot water moves constantly through a maze of shallow cracks and channels in the rock. That water is loaded with dissolved silica, picked up from the rock at depth where the temperatures are highest. As the water rises toward the surface and gradually cools, that silica comes out of solution and sticks to the walls of the channels. Slowly, over months and years, it builds up a hard, glassy coating, layer after layer. And here is the trap. That coating is essentially waterproof. As it thickens, it can seal a channel completely shut. And that channel used to be a safety valve. It was quietly letting heat and pressure escape to the surface, day after day, harmlessly. Once it seals over, the hot water and steam trapped beneath have nowhere to go. Pressure climbs, temperature climbs, and you end up with superheated water squeezed under a lid of rock and mineral. A natural pressure cooker, buried just a few feet beneath ground that people walk across. And from the surface, it looks completely ordinary. Some steam, warm soil, maybe a beautiful blue pool that photographs well. It stays that way, calm and unremarkable, right up until the rock above simply cannot hold anymore. When that seal finally breaks, pressure drops instantly. The superheated water flashes into steam in a fraction of a second, and steam takes up vastly more space than liquid water, so it expands with enormous force. Then the ground above either blows outward violently, or, as we saw in the days after June the 13th, it loses its support and falls inward instead. Same trapped pressure. 2 very different ways of failing. Now connect that mechanism back to the instruments sitting 100 meters away. The single most valuable thing they could have recorded is a precursor. Some small signal in the minutes or hours before the blast that says the seal is about to fail. A slow creep in temperature. A subtle shift in the pressure readings. A flicker of tiny micro-earthquakes as the rock begins to crack apart underneath. If that signal exists in the data, then for the first time, the observatory has a real foothold on forecasting. A way to say, even a few minutes ahead of time, that one specific patch of ground is about to give out. But there is a darker possibility, and scientists are not hiding from it. The 2024 explosion gave no clear warning at all, nothing usable. If this new close-range data also shows nothing, if the ground stayed completely calm right up to the instant it tore open, then the more frightening version of this hazard gets confirmed. It would mean these explosions can strike out of total silence, with no detectable warning of any kind, in terrain where millions of people walk every summer with cameras in their hands. Both answers are enormous, and this is the first time in history we have had the data to even ask the question properly. That is why this small event matters more than a big one. Which brings us to the bigger picture and to the phrase in the title of this video. June the 13th did not come out of nowhere. It is the newest chapter in a story that has been unfolding at this exact spot for almost 2 years. And once you see the pattern laid out, the words new phase stop sounding dramatic and start sounding accurate. After the 2024 blast, Black Diamond Pool did not settle down. It erupted again in May of 2025. It erupted again, muddy and violent, in December of 2025. Most of those events had no audience at all for the simple reason that the area was already closed to the public, but the instruments kept watching. The occasional trained observer kept taking notes. The pool kept talking, even with nobody standing there to listen. Stop and think about that closure for a moment, because it is very easy to skip past. An entire basin inside the most famous national park in the United States, a place that used to have steady lines of visitors walking its boardwalks, taking photographs, pointing at the steam, fenced off from the public for nearly 2 straight years. Nobody makes that decision lightly. Closures cost money. They frustrate visitors. They generate complaints. That is the National Park Service saying, in the clearest way it can, that the ground there is not safe to stand on, and that it has not become safer with time. So here is the full shape of it. A major explosion in 2024, a run of smaller eruptions through 2025, and now, in 2026, a fresh explosion opening brand new ground right beside the pool, followed by days of collapse and a new spouting feature that essentially built itself out of nothing. That is not a system that blew once and calmed down. That is a shallow underground plumbing network that has been actively reorganizing itself for nearly 2 years, finding weak points, sealing old paths, opening new ones, refusing to return to any kind of stable balance. Looking back now, the 2024 explosion reads less like a freak accident and more like the opening act of an unstable period that we are still living inside. June the 13th is simply what that instability looks like while it is still happening. And this is exactly where the internet gets everything wrong. Every single time Yellowstone does something even slightly unusual, the same wave of claims floods social media within hours. The supervolcano is waking up. The government knows something and is not telling you. New vents and rising steam are the final warning before a blast that ends a continent. Those clips get millions of views. They are designed to. I want to take that seriously enough to answer it properly, because the truth here is both calmer and, honestly, far more interesting than the myth. Here is what the actual data says. Yellowstone's volcano alert level remains at normal. The aviation color code remains green. Through the month of May, the entire park recorded only 45 small earthquakes. The largest measured magnitude 2.0. You would not feel that if you were standing directly on top of it. There were no earthquake swarms, no significant ground deformation, and no signal anywhere in the magmatic system suggesting that molten rock is rising toward the surface. A hydrothermal explosion like the one in June is a shallow local steam event. It is driven by groundwater and pressure a few feet down. It is not magma pushing upward. And it is absolutely not a precursor to a caldera-scale eruption. On the supervolcano question specifically, the science is genuinely reassuring. The giant underneath is not stirring, and the people who study it full-time are saying so plainly. But here is the part the fear accounts consistently get backwards, and it deserves a moment of your attention. There is a real hazard at Yellowstone. It is just not the one from the movies. The honest danger is not lava. The honest danger is exactly what this entire story has been about. A thin, sealed crust of superheated ground, holding back near-boiling water in places where visitors casually walk every summer. Ground that can fail with little or no warning whatsoever. In 2024, it destroyed a boardwalk moments after people managed to run off it. So the fear people feel online is not fake. It is simply aimed at the wrong target. Millions of people are frightened of a magma chamber sitting miles below their feet, while the thing that could genuinely hurt someone is the crust directly under their shoes. To keep this in proportion, it helps to know how often the Earth here actually does this. Small hydrothermal explosions like June the 13th are not rare at all. Something around this size happens somewhere in Yellowstone roughly once a year. Bigger events get rarer as they get bigger. An explosion on the scale of the Porkchop Geyser event in 1989 which left a debris ring about 15 feet across that you can still see today, comes along every few years. An explosion large enough to leave a serious crater happens maybe once every few centuries. And the truly massive ones, larger than 10 acres across, arrive perhaps once every several thousand years. For a sense of scale, the largest hydrothermal explosion crater on Earth sits along the northern edge of Yellowstone Lake. It is called Mary Bay. It is about 1.5 miles across. It was blasted out roughly 13,800 years ago. And here's the detail that should stay with you. Steam did that, not lava, not a supervolcano. Water, heat, and trapped pressure carved a 1.5 mile hole into the planet. So by raw size, June the 13th sits comfortably at the small, frequent end of a very long historical scale. It is not the event itself that makes this special. What makes it special is two things, and neither one is the size of the bang. First, it is the closest a hydrothermal explosion has ever occurred to dedicated scientific instruments, ever recorded. Second, it is the first time scientists have watched on camera a brand new pool form by collapse and then begin spouting on its own in the days that followed. That is the genuine first here, not the explosion, the record of it, and the slow motion failure that came after. Last request, and then I will get out of your way. If you have made it this far, you are clearly the kind of person who actually wants to understand things, so help this video find more people like you. Like it. Comment with one thing that surprised you most, because I read those and they shaped the next video. And subscribe, because I am tracking this story until the Observatory releases what those 4 instruments captured. That episode is going to be worth waiting for. So what should you actually watch for from here? The Yellowstone Volcano Observatory is now sitting on a data set unlike anything it has ever had access to before. The question hanging over all of it is simple. Does that close-range recording contain a genuine precursor? If it does, expect a real, meaningful step forward in our ability to forecast these events. Not perfect prediction, but something. A warning window where there was never one before. If it does not, expect scientists to say so plainly and honestly, and expect Biscuit Basin to stay closed. Because the lesson in that case would be brutal in its simplicity. This ground can fail with no notice at all. Watch the new collapse pool too. Whether it keeps spouting, quiets down, or continues to grow will tell us whether that underground system is still tearing itself apart or finally finding a new balance. A pool that calms is a system healing. A pool that keeps growing is a system still hunting for a new way out. And watch the park itself. Watch which areas stay closed and which quietly reopen. Closures are the most honest signal the public ever gets. They are not press releases or headlines. They are decisions made by people who have studied the data and concluded that the risk is real enough to disappoint thousands of visitors. When a basin stays fenced off for 2 years, that fence is telling you something the news is not. There is something humbling in all of this, and I want to leave you with it. We like to imagine that danger announces itself, that the Earth gives us a countdown, a rumble, a warning shot, something cinematic with time to react. But what happened at Biscuit Basin was the exact opposite of cinematic. A patch of ordinary dirt with no name, no history, and no reputation quietly held a pressure cooker beneath it for years. Nobody watched it. Nobody suspected it. It never appeared in a single photograph as anything other than background. And then, one morning in the dark, with no audience at all, it opened. And it kept going. It cracked. It flushed a river's worth of gray sediment 4 miles downstream. It sank. It boiled. It built a new mouth for itself and started throwing boiling water into the air on its own schedule for a full week, while the internet argued about a supervolcano that was doing absolutely nothing. That contrast is the whole lesson. The threat people fear is enormous, distant, and extremely unlikely in any of our lifetimes. The threat that is real is small, local, quiet, and sitting a few feet under the soles of people's shoes. One makes for a better movie. The other is the one that actually shaped a boardwalk full of running tourists in 2024. The supervolcano is not waking up. The data could not be clearer on that point, and anyone telling you otherwise is selling you fear for clicks. But something else is true at the same time, and it deserves your attention far more than any doomsday headline ever will. The ground inside Yellowstone's thermal basins has just shown us, in more detail than has ever been recorded in human history, that it can tear open, cave inward, and boil over for days at a time. Not miles beneath the surface, a few feet beneath it. The most dangerous thing in America's first national park was never the sleeping giant below. It was always the thin, quiet crust on top. And this June, standing right in front of the best instruments we have ever pointed at it, that crust finally showed us exactly what it can do.